In this module on labor economics, we're going to begin to discuss a concept referred to as monopsony. In fact, we'll specifically look at monopsony labor, we'll look at a monopsony labor market model, and then we'll look at labor's profits and mobility costs within the framework or lens of monopsony labor. Let's begin by thinking about the concept of monopoly and monopsony. Monopsony is to the factor input market what monopoly is to the goods market output model. Let me explain what I mean by that. In a basic goods market where we have manufactured a good and we're selling it into the marketplace, we find that firms are going to be able to, if they're competitive, they're going to be able to have some goods market equilibrium where we identify a market clearing price and a market clearing quantity of that good, such that the firm is a price taker. It does not set the price of its product. It prices it based upon the market influences of supply and demand. When a firm is not in a competitive market, and if there's only one supplier of a good to a marketplace, that's referred to as a monopoly. If there's only one manufacturer of shoes in a market, or one manufacturer of cable television in a market, those manufacturers have a monopoly. And we often think commonly as consumers that monopolies set prices. In fact, they don't. Monopoly producers are subject to the exact same microeconomic construct as any other producer. They want to produce a quantity of a good where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Well, in a monopoly goods market, if we have what might have otherwise been a P star or a market clearing price, which is going to be equal to our marginal cost, if that is a constant here, it tells us that the marginal cost is constant no matter how many units we're manufacturing, which would suggest that it's a very competitive factor input market. Then this is our marginal cost curve, and our marginal revenue curve cuts down through our x-axis from the same point on the y-axis where the demand curve intercepts. In fact, in a pure monopoly, the marginal revenue curve is going to transect the x-axis exactly halfway between 0 and the point at which the demand curve transects that axis. So a perfect monopoly will be exactly halfway through here, which means the slope of the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as the slope of the demand curve. If the marginal revenue curve is swinging more closely to the demand curve, or it's moving to the right towards the demand curve, it means that there is still some kind of monopolistic influence in the marketplace, some imperfection in the marketplace, but we still don't have perfect competition. Well, in this case, the producer is going to set the quantity of goods that they will produce at the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. They could charge P star for that, and then they would be at a zero profit condition, but at a very low number of units sold. That doesn't serve them all that well for many reasons, as you can imagine. Or they could go ahead and, based upon that quantity of goods, they could apply that quantity value to the demand curve, and that would cause them to realize that they could similarly sell this good for PM, or price of monopoly. So the monopoly producer isn't actually a price setter, but they're kind of a price maker by virtue of the fact that they set the quantity of the good they're going to produce based upon this economic concept of marginal cost and marginal revenue, and that would allow them then to charge price of monopoly for the quantity in monopoly. Well, this is a monopoly in the goods market. This is all about the good being manufactured. And this is what happens when there is one producer of a good. Here you can see a little bit of some of the values that we might be able to attribute to this market if we have a quantity demand equation. And we're going to imply a quantity supplied equation, even though there's no express supply curve in this market. We're going to imply it because we're going to think about what creates the point here at P star and what otherwise might have been thought of as Q star in this goods market, or the market for a good that's being manufactured in production. And we're going to recognize then that we have, based upon this demand relationship, at different prices, I've got our table here from 0 to 66 in prices, we have different quantities demanded And we then know that we can have a total revenue, which is our price times our quantity, is going to equal total revenue. And then our marginal revenue, which is this curve that I'm suggesting is cutting halfway between the 0 axis and where the demand curve crosses the x-axis. Our marginal revenue is simply a change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity, which gives us these values. And if you plotted that, you would find that these values are right along with my marginal revenue curve here. And that we're going to form the number of units approximately, or as close as we can get it with our table, to where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Now it's interesting. Recognize that marginal cost equals marginal revenue at a quantity slightly greater than 47. If we come over here, marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We know marginal cost is 30, so where's marginal revenue 30? Well, marginal revenue is below 30 here at 26.33 at a quantity of 56, and it's actually above 30 at a quantity of 47. It's 32.33. Now, the holy grail of microeconomics is producing where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. But if you can't do that, if your units of production don't nicely match up with that, then you want to produce it where marginal cost is less than, just barely less than marginal revenue. The concept being you never want your cost to be greater than your revenue. That is a loss, and that is the plague within production and manufacturing. We never want to design a loss. So in this case, we're going to suggest that this producer is going to produce 47 units at a marginal cost of 30, marginal revenue of 32.33. And when we identify then what the producer could charge for that good, we take that quantity and move it up to the demand curve, and we find that at a quantity of 47, we actually could charge a price of 51, which is our price of monopoly. Well, these rules are not dissimilar to the rules of monopsony in this market. So let's go ahead and think about this a little bit further. What is a monopsony? A monopsony is not where there is one producer of a good that is being manufactured for output. A monopsony is where there is one buyer of a good. And in this case, we're talking about a factor of production. Labor is a factor of production. So it's an input to production. And so monopsony labor is where there is one buyer of labor in a market or a primary buyer of labor in a market. An example of this might be if you and I live in a small town, let's say in Appalachia, and we work in a coal mine, and the coal mine owns the town, the coal mine owns the store, the coal mine owns the gas station, the mining company owns the road, owns the home we live in, and owns virtually everything, and we're probably 50 or 60 miles from the next closest town, and that firm has some significant monopsony labor power over our lives. It is the only buyer of labor in that whole town. So if we're going to be in that town, and if we're going to live in that town and work in that town, we're going to work for that firm. Well, that would suggest to us that ultimately the firm has some significant influence over what we get paid. It's not going to be a case in which our wages are a result of some supply and demand relationship. There's a demand, or there's a labor supply relationship here. That's us. But there's no demand that's endogenously or perhaps organically set. There's only a demand that is set based upon this confluence of marginal cost and marginal revenue. We say that large employers in a market where there's only a few other small employers, or maybe a large powerful union, would have great monopsony power. The only employer in an area would have great monopsony power. Even though there might be a perfectly competitive goods market, lots of different goods being manufactured, maybe being sold all over the country, all over the state, well outside of our little market, where there are lots and lots of competitors in other parts of the state and country that manufacture that good. But in terms of the buyer of labor in our little market, our little town, we then will believe that there is some significant monopsony relationship. This would suggest to us then, if we're using the little town, or we're using a worker of a particular labor set, well, a particular skill set, even in a large town where there's only one company that wants to buy that labor. Let's assume that you're a radiology technician, and there's only one health clinic, hospital in your town and in your area. But there's lots and lots of other employers, but the only one that employs radiology techs is this hospital group. Well, they would be a monopsony employer of your kind of labor, and they're going to then have some significant power over the number of employees they have with your type of labor and what those employees are going to pay. If you think about it, some level of monopsony exists within all firms, because we know that all firms that are actually making a profit are receiving a little bit more marginal revenue than they are experiencing in marginal cost. So there's a marginal profit, and that can only exist where there's at least a little bit of monopsony power. We tend to attribute this to mobility costs. So if I'm in that market, let's say I'm the radiology tech, maybe there's 2 hospital groups, but there's only 2, and I have a wage it's less than I think I should. Maybe my wage is less than my marginal revenue product of labor. Then I'm experiencing some monopsony influence over my labor. It's keeping my labor's wage down a little bit, less than it could be. And this is a function of mobility and mobility costs. If I could afford to move to another marketplace, let's say a large market like Los Angeles or San Francisco or Chicago or Dallas or New York, where there are numerous healthcare systems, then perhaps the market wage for a radiology tech would be more than the wage I'm receiving right now. And I might suppose then that the cost of that mobility is going to be synonymous with the additional wage I might be able to receive by going to that market. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a segment or module a little bit further on in the course about mobility and immigration. So let's then think about monopsony as a condition in the labor market where there is a primary employer in the market that has some significant power over the market. And through looking at labor market models, we'll see how that power relates to the wages that are paid.